Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Coffee Shop Philosophy. As always, I'm your host Killian Hobbs, Managing Editor for Being Libertarian LLC. Don't forget that you can follow me directly on Facebook just by searching Killian Hobbs Author, and of course don't forget to check out the rest of the Think Liberty Network for all of the other different shows that we have on there. I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping things that I just want to list off here. Regarding the Stateless Productions project that I was working on, or that I am working on, I should say. I just wanted to give a massive thank you to the contributors that might be listening to the show here. We have cleared, as of the time of this recording, we have cleared the $15,000 we were looking for as part of the fundraising for it, which is just amazing how quickly the donations have been coming in to start getting this project off the ground. Obviously, any money that comes in above and beyond that will go towards making an even better project. So if you haven't already, then you can go to the Stateless Productions Facebook page and definitely see the option to donate there. And, of course, Think Liberty does have its own Patreon as well. So if you like the content that comes out with either the various shows that we do, videos that come out, obviously the people that work and put together all the memes and everything else like that, there's a lot of technical work that goes on in the background to make sure that all these things can happen. So if you wanted to support through the Patreon, or even going to the Think Liberty shop and taking a look at some of the different products we've got there, a bunch of different t-shirts and the like that might interest you, do make sure to do so. All that said, though, I was going to jump right into the episode today. For those of you that haven't seen the news just yet, which by the time you'll be listening to this, you probably would have already come across it. Ross Perot has died. He died at the age of 89 after, I believe it was a 5-month battle with leukemia. His family broke the news a few days back there from when you'll be listening to this. You know, complete random ADD moment side note. It's always strange how I have to talk about the future to the past, because I know that I'm recording it, but it's going to air a few days later. But I'm referring to things that will be in your past, but my present. It's a strange experience when I spend too much time thinking about it. But anyway, carrying along from there, most people will remember Ross Perot from his presidential runs in 1992 and 1996. And I'm going to get into some of the things that he stood for, some of the ideas that were play there. But I also want to talk about what his career, especially his political career, means and what kind of influence it had when it comes to the liberty movement. I'll start with the man himself, though. So, for those that only know him from his short stint in political career, Ross Perot actually primarily got started originally working for IBM, and then eventually starting a company called Electronics Data Systems, which was a data processing company. Now, that company's controlling interest got sold to General Motors back in the 80s. After that, he developed his own company, Perot Systems, and also became an investor with a company with Steve Jobs. I believe the company was Next. Yes, it was Next that he ended up in being an angel investor for. He did a whole bunch of different things like that, but he started to get more and more involved politically in regards to the Vietnam War, POW issues with missing in actions, and also his defining point, which was his opposition to the North American Free Trade Agreement. Now, the key thing that people remember from him would have been his political career. So, his early political career, like I mentioned, involved dealing with things like the POW issue after the Vietnam War, and just various forms of opposition, primarily against George W. Bush Sr. This eventually led to his independent presidential run. So for those of you that were around in 1992, which was when he announced that he was going to be running for presidency if he could get ballot access in all 50 states. He pushed for things such as balancing the federal budget. One of his ideas, including that spending should not exceed revenue for almost 27 years, I believe was the amount that he had quoted. He was opposed to different forms of gun control. He wanted to end the outsourcing of jobs, which was starting to take place, because that was around the period of time in the United States when the country was starting to shift away from manufacturing and move more into the kind of quasi-service industry focus that it's known for now, where it's very customer heavy or financial district heavy. Back then, throughout the late 70s, throughout the 80s and so on, it was much more manufacturer driven, and those types of jobs were starting to be outsourced and more easily outsourced because of some of the conditions that were built into NAFTA, which was part of why he opposed the concept so badly. More on that a little bit later, though. I'm not going to dig into the pros and cons there just yet. He made the run in that election. There was a whole bunch of controversy around his run, including someone accusing him of being a CIA plant with ties to Bush, which, funny enough, considering the results of that election, probably worked out, probably would have proved pretty false and pretty straightforwardly false, to say the least. In that election, he ended up taking the highest popular vote of any third party or independent presidential candidate since Roosevelt. A lot of people forget Roosevelt ran as a third party. He was not part of the standard party system at the time. He had the highest amount at, I believe it was about 19% or just shy of 19% of the popular vote. Didn't win any electoral votes, but still, an independent presidential candidate coming in and taking in, call it 20% of the popular vote in a national election with no, previous political history, just kind of came in and took it. And did so on his own. That's the key thing. Because, obviously with President Trump in recent years, someone with very limited political background hopping into a party and winning the presidency, that just seems like something that can happen. That's, we've got living proof that someone can come in without that kind of experience and simply take on the presidency. But the fact that he did it without that kind of background party support, that is something that I think is politically interesting, especially when we try to look at the success rates of other third parties and try and take a look at what the differences are. I'll touch briefly on his secondary election that he was in momentarily, but one thing that's key to note is that in that presidential election in 92, one of the arguments that was made against his run was that if he hadn't have run, a lot of those votes would have gone to Bush Sr., in which case he would have won the next term and we wouldn't have had the first term Clinton. I personally disagree with that notion. I know that it's generally accepted, but a lot of the voter base that he was pulling in was a mix between liberals, conservatives, but the bulk of it was middle-class moderates. Those were the people that he was winning over, which I think is very interesting when you consider his overall success rate as well, that was his target audience. Going into the 96 election, that's when he started the Reform Party. The Reform Party, which it still technically exists, but I say technically because for all intents and purposes, since 2000, the party has been on a continuous erode with a series of infight after infight after infight. By the time the next election had rolled around, Ross Perot basically backed out of the party that he had started, going as far as to actually endorse the Republican candidate, in which case, for the last 20-odd years of his life, he was considered just be a Republican at that point. But Yeah, the 1996 election. In that election, he didn't make it to the actual presidential debate, which he did in the 92 election. He didn't really do much of anything in that election, to be frank. He still had a very high voter turnout for him. I think it was about 8.5 or 9% of the popular vote, which was a massive dip from the previous election. However, still a massive amount, considering that even though he was still now backed by a party, for all intents and purposes, it was still running as an independent. One of the things that really worked against him in that particular time was a rather poor debate between him and Vice President Al Gore, which actually, post-debate, people that were polled on it ended up supporting NAFTA more instead of less after hearing some of his arguments for it. Later on in life, he continued with some of his business work. He continued somewhat being involved in politics, but not as much. Occasionally, he would bow his head in and throw the occasional endorsement out, but for all intents and purposes, other than those slight public endorsements here and there, he simply stayed back and started to peel himself away from the public life that he had kind of set up for himself. Now, the reason his life and his presidential run is worth considering and it's worth looking through, especially when it comes to the liberty movement in general, is the sweeping success rate that he had. If it's one thing that I've noticed when we look at overall success rates, and this is not just in North America, but in any country really, when we look at the success rates of new parties or of independents that have come practically out of nowhere, when we look at these people and we see the ones that become the shining stars and the ones that rise up almost meteorically, there's always a very, very obvious trend that links them, even if their ideologies aren't linked. I always use the Canadian Party, the NDP, and their history and the way that they grew and expanded and developed into a proper third party up here. A third party to the point where, for those that are unaware, with the parliamentary system that we have in Canada, you have a primary party and then you have the opposition party. And then any of the other party seat holders, they just have seats, basically. But we've gotten to the point where the third party has, in several instances, either won entire provinces, which is our version of states, or has become the major opposition in those cases, pushing out either the Liberals or the Conservatives from that standard two-party role. So their history, the original history of the Republican Party, way back pre-Lincoln even, at its actual foundation, the kickstart of the Reform Party and the rise of Ross Perot in the political light, all of these success stories, I'll say success stories, even though some faltered, but in comparison to all of the other attempts that are made, we can call these success stories. All of these success stories have a few key things in common. The first thing that they have in common is their targeted audience. Their targeted audience for their stances, for their beliefs, is not specifically right-wing or specifically left-wing. It's generally moderates. It starts off by going after the moderates with very baseline needs assessments. So what I mean here is that, using the NDP again, for example, they pushed and grew on the idea of socializing healthcare. Now, that's not a centrist position, of course. That's definitely more to the left, or definitely farther left than some of the other solutions might be. But their push for it was driven from a very basic, how do we make things work for Canadians, and how do we do it so that people can survive? Because not everybody's going to have the money for these things. And they weren't thinking in the sense of, like the libertarian arguments would have, where the government shouldn't be involved in those things, because realistically the government's involved in a bunch of other things. So the NDP positioned themselves on, well, why not this too, considering how important this is to literally everybody. This doesn't serve one particular group over another. It serves literally everybody. So let's focus on this. That was one of their key push points that led to their growth. They expanded some of their other policies and again ended up definitely developing further and further left, to the point where they're our version of the Democratic Socialists for all intents and purposes. And again, whether you agree or disagree with their stances, I personally disagree with them, pretty much all of them. I can still appreciate the methodology that was used and the way that they garnered that support and the way that they picked a topic that they knew was going to impact the average person. And that became the focal point that they grew out of. If you look into the history of the Republican Party in the United States is the exact same way. It had, at the peak agricultural period of the United States, it was a very, very focused campaign around a single issue. And it was through that single issue push that they added on a couple of other ideas that sort of fit so that they were a little bit more rounded off, but they led the charge through that single item. The Green Party. There's tons of Green parties in tons of different countries, and almost all of them, their leading issue is the environment. The parties that are a little bit more rounded off and actually have some answers for things like foreign policy and the like built into their platforms, they are more successful than the ones that come in with just the environment as everything and they don't have an answer for anything else. I'll use another Canadian party that actually is, I would say, almost unfortunately popular, the Bloc Québécois, which is basically a French separatist party. And they get a massive amount of seats because they push for the French-Canadian existence, I'll say. There's a lot more to it than that, but I think just their existence, their way of life, the way that they are, their custom, their ideas, distinct society, those are the things that that party pushes on, and they are exceedingly successful because of it. We can flip over to, we'll flip back to Ross Perot. Ross Perot's leading point was balancing the budget, fixing corruption in Washington, doing away with NAFTA, and stopping the outsourcing of jobs. One of the key things that he pushed on, the biggest point that he pushed on during those election runs, was to stop the, as he put it, the great sucking sound of jobs leaving for Mexico. Now, when we look at actual free trade, because we have to keep in mind there's a big difference between actual laissez-faire free trade and the free trade agreement that was NAFTA, because it had a whole bunch of provisions in it that, well, they just kind of spit in the face of actual laissez-faire capitalism. But in it, he saw an issue that the people felt. And again, we can wax philosophical and pull out charts and talk economics about how globalization actually works, or the fact that markets should be free and employers should be free to be able to get their workers from where they choose and do this and do that. We can wax philosophical all day on it, but that would be missing the point. The point is, he took an issue that he knew would be near and dear to the majority of American voters. He knew that they didn't like the way that politics were working in the United States. He knew that people were worried about other countries outsourcing work because as transit became cheaper for actually shipping and moving products across borders, as that became cheaper and the labor obviously lower because of either lower living conditions and just the difference in exchange rates, as those differences came in, it was inevitable that some of those jobs were going to be moved to other countries. Now, it didn't lead to a net job loss like everyone feared. That's a misconception when it comes to, well, any form of job being replaced, really. Even if jobs are replaced with automation, illegal immigration, outsourcing, etc., 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 it almost always leads year after year after year to more net jobs in total existing. Even if a particular industry runs out of one job or another, you still end up with more jobs total as the industry changes and the market changes. That's a whole other animal. I actually tackled most of that in, I believe it was the 9th edition of the Bad Arguments series, but you can read that at your leisure. I'm not going to take your time to go through the depths of those arguments now. My point is that regardless of your stance on it, it was the thing that he led with, and he took that point, that key central point, and he drove it home. That was the lead point for him. He had other issues that attracted people from other sides as well. He was pro-choice. He listed himself as reluctantly pro-choice after he became Republican in the 2000s and later on. But during the 80s, 90s, so on and so forth, he was very pro-choice. He was an activist for pro-choice, going as far as to actively support Planned Parenthood. Economically, he was heavily against the concept of there being a national debt. Some of his solutions, and again, obviously it's mostly libertarians that are going to be listening to this, so they'll probably disagree with this, of course, but he was a big fan of the concept of increasing capital gains tax, but giving tax breaks to small and medium businesses and to new businesses as well. So transferring the debt burden when it comes to businesses at large to the larger corporations and taking some of that pressure off of the more entrepreneur-sized businesses. Obviously, like I mentioned, he was heavily against NAFTA. He was heavily against the outsourcing of jobs, which was one of his key things against NAFTA to begin with. And he wanted the balanced budget. Again, and also his absolute opposition to gun control. That combination of things brought in a couple people that would have been further on the left, a couple people that would have been further on the right, but by having a couple things that were all worked out independent of each other, it made it look as if each idea was developed based on the issue itself rather than a pre-existing ideology. He wasn't basing things necessarily, obviously he had his own internal philosophy, but it wasn't designed around just conservatism. He was definitely a fiscal conservative. Socially, considering some of his stances, you could probably consider him socially liberal, which does sound pretty libertarian, but he didn't take on any realistic libertarian stances other than hating the corruption in Washington, you could say, and hating government acts and trade agreements and things like that, or them being involved in that in any way, shape, or form. But that's neither here nor there. The point is that Ross Perot came in as an independent, and he noticed the trend. He noticed what you need to do in order to be successful there. And he came in practically out of nowhere as an independent and took almost 20% of the vote because he was able to follow that formula. This is something that the Libertarian Party and just the liberty movement in general hasn't really been able to capture, because there isn't really a single issue that affects or that the average person is going to agree on that the Libertarian Party pushes for. The closest would be wanting to reduce taxes. But even now, in today's political climate, not everybody wants taxes reduced. They might want it reduced for the little guy, but they definitely don't want it reduced for corporations. If it's a business, they want them paying as much of the tax as possible and the average person paying as little as possible, which doesn't quite gel with the even application philosophy that libertarianism has. They also generally want a government to still exist, which there's quite a few libertarians that definitely do not. There's quite a different variety of flavors of anarchists out there. And even though there's been anarchists and classical liberals that are part of the party, when people start to investigate the party, they're going to come across the anarchists. In which case they're going to say, well, I really don't want to vote for the complete abolition of government because that sounds like nonsense to me, so I'm just going to step away from them. So they never really quite learn what the rest of the Libertarian Party or the Libertarian movement is about. And again, it doesn't have to be specifically the Libertarian Party. It could be any liberty-based movement. But again, the key point there to take away, I don't know why I keep saying key point. I've said that probably about 20 times at this point. I seem to be, sometimes I catch a phrase and I just end up using it because it just fits the sentences that I need so perfectly. But I also know that it leads to endless repetition, so apologies for that. I'll wrap this all up, though, just by saying that looking into political careers like this and seeing the way that they developed, the way that they gained ground, and what kind of moves were made, it's that type of political analysis that we really need in the liberty movement to make candidates successful and to make a political party successful. We haven't really been able to capture that kind of success in the liberty movement outside of maybe liberty-leaning candidates in either the Republican or the Democratic Party. We haven't been able to capture that as a movement on our own, simply because we try to push the entire philosophy at once, and so much of the philosophy is interdependent on other aspects of the philosophy because of that consistency aspect that is just core to libertarian ideas. If we can take the evolution of Ross Perot's career, at least the early bits of it, obviously as time went on, his prominence in the political sphere started to diminish. But if we could take what led to his meteoric rise in the world of politics, study it, capture it, and use that kind of approach, then I think we could find the Libertarian Party being much more successful. And again, not just the Libertarian Party, but any liberty-based group could find themselves being far more successful in public eye if we did this. Last thing I'll leave off here with, just a fun little thing about Ross Perot that always made me laugh, was back when he rented a block during the Super Bowl, specifically to tell people how their taxes worked, how politicians made deals with corporations behind the scenes. He put out a commercial. You can find it on YouTube there. Put a commercial out during the Super Bowl, basically just to expose everything. That's the kind of punch that we need to see in politics today. I have a feeling, though, that we won't see a candidate or a person like Ross Perot have the same kind of meteoric rise for quite some time. It's a shame because we definitely need more of it in our modern politics, especially when we look at what the choices generally end up coming down to between the elephant and the donkey. when we see the cream of the crop, which looks a little spoiled to begin with, when those are the choices that we're left with, it's time we need more people like a Ross Perot running. Even if we disagree with their stances or what they're saying, we need that influence back into politics. And we need that acknowledgement from the general public that we don't need to stick with a two-party system. That it is possible for third-party candidates to come in, to gain support, that it's worth supporting these types of third-party candidates, and that by supporting them, we can help undo the damage that's been done over all these years by these two parties. I'll wrap everything up here. I just wanted to go back, I guess, to the beginning of the episode there. And again, just to say thank you to everyone that's donated to the Stateless Productions project. As there's more details on the project and more updates, then of course I'll give you the occasional update here as well. Don't forget to follow me on Facebook directly just by searching Killian Hobbs Author. I will eventually end up using Twitter. I've been told several times to start using Twitter, and I haven't yet, but that's mainly just because I don't like bouncing between a bunch of platforms, and I'm not that invested with Twitter. I really don't care about interacting with the army of the blue checklists, so I'll just stay away. I should have said check marks, not checklists. I don't know why I jumped to checklists. Anyway, it's about 2 a.m. when I'm recording this, so if I have the occasional slip up like that, just please forgive me. Anyway, follow me on Facebook. Don't forget to check out all the articles that come out on think-liberty.com, beinglibertarian.com, and of course rationalstandard.com. And as always, if you liked what you heard and you'd like to hear more, I'll see you again next week.